The roar of aircraft engines still rattled through the winter air that December evening in 1944, echoing off the low clouds that hung over Belgium like a shroud. Somewhere above the muddy fields outside Liège, a Messerschmitt fighter had come apart under the concentrated firepower of American escort planes, those sleek P-51 Mustangs that had turned the European skies into killing grounds for the once proud Luftwaffe. The German aviator inside that doomed aircraft had precious seconds to react as his machine disintegrated around him, metal screaming, flames licking at the cockpit. His ejection from the dying plane came late, too late for a clean descent, and when his parachute finally deployed, it snapped him violently in the harness, sending him tumbling through the cold air before he crashed into the Belgian countryside with bone-jarring force. The impact drove the breath from his lungs and opened a gash across his forehead that immediately began pouring blood down his face, warm against the December chill. His uniform, once pristine and bearing the insignia he'd worn with such certainty, now hung in tatters. Every breath came shallow and painful, his ribs possibly cracked from the landing. He lay there in the mud for only moments before he heard the voices, American voices, and the sound of boots approaching through the wet earth. The infantry patrol had him surrounded within minutes, rifles pointed, commands barked in that harsh English he barely understood. This was it, he thought. This was the moment every airman of the Reich had been warned about in those endless briefings. The propaganda films had shown him exactly what to expect now. His mind played back those grainy reels he'd watched in training halls across Germany, the narration insistent and absolute. The enemy forces, he'd been told repeatedly, were barbaric in their treatment of captured German servicemen. Torture awaited, they said. Public humiliation designed to break the spirit before breaking the body. Summary executions by the roadside, bodies left as warnings. The propaganda machine had been thorough in its construction of this narrative, painting the Americans as savage and undisciplined, lacking the military honor that supposedly defined the German armed forces. And so this pilot, bleeding into the Belgian soil, lowered his eyes and waited for what he believed was inevitable. The pride he'd felt wearing his leather flight jacket, that symbol of elite status within the Luftwaffe, now felt like nothing more than a target painted on his back. Artillery rumbled in the distance, a constant thunder that spoke of the Ardennes offensive collapsing in on itself. The pilot knew without needing intelligence briefings that thousands of his fellow airmen would never see German soil again. The war had turned irrevocably and completely. He was just one more casualty in a losing cause, one more name that would eventually appear on a list somewhere. Prison camps stretched before him in his imagination, interrogation rooms with bright lights and harsh questions, perhaps a bullet when they'd extracted everything useful. These were the paths that occupied his thoughts as he knelt there in the mud, American soldiers surrounding him with weapons ready. Then came a sound that shattered his expectations more completely than anti-aircraft fire had shattered his plane. Not the growl of a transport truck coming to haul him away to detention, not the aggressive bark of guards asserting dominance over their prisoner. Instead, he heard the distinctive wail of a medical vehicle, that piercing siren that announced urgent humanitarian purpose. An American Red Cross ambulance materialized through the mist, its headlights cutting pale beams across the darkening field. The vehicle came to a halt beside where he knelt, and two medics emerged quickly, dressed in those olive-drab uniforms that marked them as enemy combatants, yet moved with the purposeful efficiency of medical professionals anywhere. Their hands carried a canvas stretcher between them as they approached, and one of the medics knelt beside the German pilot with movements that seemed practiced and sure. Words came that the pilot's limited English couldn't fully process, but the tone carried through clearly enough. There was urgency there, certainly, the kind that came from dealing with trauma and time-sensitive injuries. There was professionalism in how they assessed his wounds, how they positioned themselves to move him safely. What there wasn't, what shocked him into a kind of mental paralysis, was cruelty. The tone held no mockery, no satisfaction at having captured an enemy, no promise of the suffering he'd been conditioned to expect. It was, impossibly, almost clinical in its detachment, almost human in its concern. His mind struggled to reconcile what his senses reported with what his training had promised. Could this be some elaborate deception, a trick designed to lower his defences before the real interrogation began? Perhaps they intended to transport him to some facility where doctors with bright lights would extract information under the guise of medical treatment. His breath caught as he felt bandages being pressed against the wound on his forehead, the sting of antiseptic solution filling his nostrils with its sharp chemical scent. They were treating him. Actually treating him. Not marching him toward execution or imprisonment, but actively working to preserve his life. The realization hit him with more force than his landing had, a cognitive dissonance so profound it felt physical. Only a handful of hours earlier, this same German pilot had been part of a combat mission aimed at Allied positions. His bombs, or his guns, had been trained on these same American forces, seeking to destroy their vehicles, kill their soldiers, disrupt their advance. He had been, in the most literal sense, an instrument of death directed at the men who now carefully lifted him onto their stretcher. The paradox cut into his understanding deeper than any shrapnel could cut into flesh. Why would a nation locked in total warfare, a country whose cities his comrades had bombed and whose soldiers he'd tried to kill just hours ago, now dedicate precious medical resources to keeping him alive? The question lingered not just in his confused thoughts, but echoed into something larger, something that history itself would need to answer. What did it mean about the nature of war, about the definition of civilization, when your enemy's first response to your capture was not vengeance, but medicine? The war's momentum by late 1944 had shifted dramatically and irreversibly. Allied bombing campaigns over Germany had grown into an almost daily occurrence, waves upon waves of heavy bombers turning industrial centres and cities into landscapes of rubble and flame. The skies that had once belonged to the Luftwaffe, those proud pilots who'd dominated European airspace in the war's early years, now crawled with American aircraft. B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators filled the air in formations so massive they darkened the ground below, escorted by those nimble P-51 Mustangs with range enough to protect the bombers all the way to their targets and back. Every week brought more Luftwaffe aircraft spiralling down in flames, more pilots bailing out over territory already controlled by advancing Allied armies, more crash landings in fields swept clean of German defenders. Captured German aviators became an increasingly common sight as winter gave way to the final months of the European conflict. The statistics tell part of that story in cold numbers. By the winter months of 1945, thousands upon thousands of Luftwaffe personnel had been taken prisoner across France, across Belgium, across the Low Countries and beyond. These weren't green recruits either, weren't inexperienced boys thrust into cockpits with minimal training. Many were veterans with years of combat experience, men who'd flown through the Battle of Britain, who'd conducted operations over the Eastern Front, who'd believed absolutely in the supposed supremacy of German air power and German military might. Their diaries and personal letters, later recovered and analysed by Allied intelligence services, reveal a consistent psychological pattern in those moments of capture. They braced themselves for the worst with an almost ritualistic certainty. These captured airmen prepared mentally for humiliation, for the jeering crowds of enemy soldiers celebrating their downfall. They readied themselves for interrogation techniques designed to extract every scrap of tactical intelligence, every detail about unit strength and aircraft capabilities and mission parameters. In the darker recesses of their thoughts, many genuinely feared they'd face immediate execution, revenge killings for the cities they'd helped bomb, for the Allied airmen they'd shot down, for the destruction they'd rained from the skies. At processing centres like Camp Shanks in New York, where thousands of prisoners of war passed through after the long Atlantic crossing, American medical officers began documenting a pattern they observed repeatedly. German prisoners arriving by ship or by train carried themselves with a kind of rigid defiance, shoulders back and faces set, almost daring their captors to do their worst. That posture held until they encountered the white hospital tents, until they saw the organised medical facilities marked with red crosses, until the bright lights of American aid stations became visible. The shift in their expressions, as one American orderly recalled years after the war ended, was nearly universal. Suspicion gave way to confusion, confusion dissolved into disbelief, and disbelief sometimes cracked into something approaching wonder. These were men who'd been raised on rhetoric that came straight from the top of the Reich's leadership, told repeatedly that America was soft and decadent, a nation of weaklings incapable of real military discipline or meaningful sacrifice. Yet here they stood, confronted with a war machine that had crushed them in aerial combat and still offered clean bandages, hot meals of eggs and bread, hospital wards organised with meticulous care. The contrast between expectation and reality couldn't have been more jarring. It struck at the fundamental assumptions that had shaped their worldview, undermined the propaganda that had sustained their certainty throughout years of warfare. The numbers behind these individual encounters reveal the enormous scale of what transpired. By the spring of 1945, more than 371,000 German prisoners were being housed across the United States alone. Many of them were airmen captured in the European theatre. Military hospitals and auxiliary medical wards, more than 500 of them scattered across the country, admitted both Allied wounded and Axis prisoners, treating them side by side in the same facilities. At Fort Sam Houston in Texas, medical reports carefully documented that German pilots received the same morphine dosages as American infantrymen, the same level of care regardless of which uniform they'd worn into battle. Casualty statistics showed recovery rates hovering around 85%, an astonishing figure for an era when infection could easily claim lives that trauma had spared, when antibiotics were still relatively new and surgical techniques were being improvised under wartime conditions. Beyond the raw numbers, though, existed something more subtle and more powerful. Prisoners of war whispered to each other in guarded conversations, sharing details they could barely believe themselves. The Americans provided cigarettes during recovery periods. Nurses actually smiled at them rather than treating them with open hostility. Even more shocking to men raised in the Reich's racial ideology, African-American orderlies tended German patients with the same professional care as anyone else. These small observations accumulated into a larger realization that perhaps everything they'd been told about their enemies was as hollow as their own propaganda had been dishonest. The German pilot who'd once sneered at American softness from the comfort of his cockpit now lay on a hospital cot staring at a whitewashed ceiling, wrestling with a question that had no easy answer. Which illusion had actually collapsed under the weight of reality? His own understanding of his enemies, or his nation's understanding of itself? The ambulance carrying its unexpected passengers bounced and jolted over the rough ground, each bump transmitted through the floor to the men inside. The captured German pilots sat or lay in silence, broken only by whispered exchanges, each man occupied with his own imagination of where this strange journey would terminate. Years of indoctrination had prepared them for very specific outcomes. The Reich's propaganda apparatus had been clear and consistent in its messaging about what Allied forces did to German prisoners. Interrogation rooms waited with blinding lights and closed fists, they'd been told. Transport vehicles rolled straight toward execution grounds where firing squads dispensed quick battlefield justice. Every lurch of the ambulance over uneven terrain deepened the dread that sat in their stomachs like lead. One lieutenant, his youth evident in features that barely looked old enough for military service, clutched at his torn flight jacket with white knuckles and muttered denials under his breath. He'd witnessed summary executions back home, had seen what the Gestapo did to German servicemen who refused orders or showed insufficient commitment to the cause. If that was how their own security services treated wavering loyalty, why would foreign enemies show greater restraint or mercy? The logic seemed inescapable, the conclusion foregone. His seatmate in the ambulance maintained complete silence, eyes fixed on the floorboards as if they might reveal some answer, convinced absolutely that this medical vehicle was simply a cruel preliminary move designed to soften them psychologically before the true brutality commenced. The air inside the ambulance was thick with the smell of medical antiseptic, that sharp chemical odour that seemed completely foreign to men who'd expected the stench of prison cellars and unwashed confinement. When the rear doors finally swung open and light flooded in, the illusion they'd constructed in their minds shattered like glass. There were no prison walls waiting to receive them, no fortified compounds with guard towers and barbed wire perimeters. Instead, they saw corridors illuminated by electric lamps, clean and bright in a way that felt almost surreal. The steady rhythm of nurses' footsteps echoed through hallways organized with obvious purpose. The sharp scent of alcohol swabs and sterilizing solutions replaced the imagined smell of dungeons. The pilots were carried on stretchers past rows of beds occupied by American soldiers, men already wounded in the ongoing battles. These Allied casualties lay bandaged and groaning with their own pain, yet none of them spat at the German prisoners being brought through. No one hurled curses or accusations. No one demanded vengeance for whatever role these Luftwaffe men might have played in creating American casualties. Instead, orderlies directed the captured airmen toward available cots, checked vital signs with practiced efficiency, offered canteens of water with a casualness that suggested this was standard procedure rather than exceptional treatment. The humiliation this created cut deeper than any physical abuse could have managed. Arrogance, that certainty of superiority that had been drummed into them through years of military training and ideological education, dissolved faster than blood being absorbed into medical gauze. These captured pilots had been trained specifically to view compassion as weakness, to mock the very idea that American military forces could match German discipline and commitment. Now they found themselves confronted with a form of discipline they'd never imagined possible. One that wielded compassion not as weakness, but as a tool more psychologically unsettling than any bomb or bullet. In one of the hospital wards, a captured Oberfeldwebel would later confess in his personal diary that he felt smaller under the neutral gaze of an American nurse than he'd ever felt while under enemy gunfire. She had tightened his bandage with careful attention and asked simply if he thought he could sleep, he recorded in cramped handwriting. Nobody in the entire Reich had ever spoken to him quite that way, with that combination of professional detachment and basic human concern. Such small acts, almost trivial in isolation, cut more deeply into certainty than any propaganda leaflet dropped over German cities ever could. These weren't grand gestures designed for publicity or morale purposes. They were quiet moments of routine medical care extended without apparent hesitation to men who'd been trying to kill Americans just hours or days earlier. Statistics began to accumulate that mirrored these individual experiences. Reports filed throughout January 1945 revealed numbers that seemed almost impossible to captured Germans hearing them second-hand. Nearly 80% of German prisoners brought directly into Allied hospital facilities survived their injuries, many of them wounds that would have been fatal without immediate professional medical intervention. That same level of care could not be said for countless civilians trapped in the rubble of German cities, places like Cologne or Dresden, where Allied bombing had created conditions where even minor injuries could become death sentences due to collapsed infrastructure and absent medical resources. The contrast was not lost on the airmen recovering in American wards. Their enemy was offering them life while their own regime's decisions had created conditions where their families and neighbours often had no access to basic medical care. These hospital wards weren't entirely free from tension, weren't somehow magically cleansed of the hatred that warfare generates. Some American patients deliberately turned their faces away when German pilots were carried past or placed in nearby beds. A young private from Ohio, his arm now amputated at the shoulder, muttered with bitter anger that the man being treated beside him might well have been the very pilot who'd dropped the bomb that took his limb. The silence that followed such moments hung heavy in the air, thick with unresolved rage and grief. But the nurses carried on with their duties regardless, never hesitating in their care, never allowing personal feelings to override professional medical ethics. The ambulance had not transported these captured aviators toward interrogation chambers or execution yards. Instead, it had delivered them into an entirely different kind of battlefield, one where fundamental assumptions about humanity itself contested for dominance over wartime hatred. The sharp hiss of disinfectant being applied to wounds filled spaces where they'd expected the sounds of violence and degradation. When the ambulance doors swung fully open, that distinctive hiss of medical disinfectant seemed to announce a different world entirely. For wounded pilots conditioned by years of propaganda to expect the worst from enemy capture, this represented the moment when humiliation should begin, when the systematic stripping away of dignity would commence like the opening act of some terrible theatre. What their eyes actually registered defied every expectation their training had installed. Canvas stretchers slid smoothly from the ambulance interior, but their destination wasn't a prison cell or interrogation facility. Instead, they moved directly into fluorescent-lit corridors that belonged to a functioning United States Army hospital, organized and clean in ways that seemed to belong to peacetime rather than the chaos of total war. They were carried past rows of military cots where American soldiers and captured German personnel lay in the same ward, separated only by the thin walls of military discipline and medical necessity. For men who'd been explicitly told that their enemies would jeer and mock, that hostile crowds would spit and curse at their humiliation, the relative silence of the hospital ward created more shock than overt cruelty would have. The bandages were clean, crisp white rather than stained, reused cloth. The nurses moved with practiced efficiency, their actions free of the malice or contempt the pilots had steeled themselves to endure. One particular pilot would recall years later the moment when the smell of ether filled his lungs as an anesthetic mask descended toward his face. His thoughts in that moment went to his mother back in Hamburg, a woman who'd written in her most recent letter about crouching in basement shelters while Allied bombs shook the earth above, bringing down buildings and starting fires that consumed entire neighborhoods. And now here he was, the very hand that had once carried destruction toward Allied targets, being kept alive through careful medical intervention by those same people who had the absolute power to simply let him die. That contradiction struck him with more force than the piece of shrapnel currently embedded in his thigh. It was a cognitive dissonance that couldn't be resolved through military training or ideological certainty. Gossip and rumour spread even within these clinical hospital spaces, whispered conversations between German airmen trying to make sense of their situation. They shared observations in low voices about the meals being served, noting with disbelief that their rations included eggs and real coffee, luxuries that had become almost mythical back home in Germany, where years of rationing had reduced civilian populations to surviving on powdered substitutes and increasingly thin slices of black bread. One captured sergeant muttered his amazement as an American orderly casually handed him toast spread with actual butter, confessing that even his own family back in Cologne hadn't seen such richness in years of wartime privation. The quiet, everyday chatter of American nurses going about their duties provided another layer of unreality. They discussed baseball scores and ration coupon management, talked about the dance halls they hoped to visit when next granted leave. These fragments of absolutely normal peacetime life seemed stranger to the German prisoners than the warfare itself. Back home, every conversation eventually circled back to the war, to victories and defeats, to survival and sacrifice. Here, medical staff could bandage an enemy combatant and then immediately return to mundane concerns about entertainment and minor domestic inconveniences. But not every moment in these wards carried that surreal normality. In one section of the hospital, an American infantryman who'd survived a German bombing raid on Antwerp kept his head resolutely turned away when medical personnel wheeled a Luftwaffe pilot into the bed beside his own. The American's missing leg, already stitched and bound under clean dressings, told its own silent and terrible story without need for words. For a single heartbeat, the entire room seemed to freeze, everyone aware of the awful proximity of victim and perpetrator, of destroyed and destroyer, until a nurse simply drew the privacy curtain between the beds and continued with her assigned tasks. Humanity wasn't without its scars and unhealed wounds, but it pressed forward anyway with professional steadiness. The statistical record that accumulated throughout those months underlined the deep paradox of the situation. Official army records from early 1945 documented that German prisoners of war admitted into American military hospitals enjoyed survival rates nearly identical to those of Allied wounded personnel, hovering around 85% across all facilities. During a period when penicillin remained scarce and battlefield medicine consumed vast quantities of resources, this equality of care represented far more than just medical practice following standard protocols. It was deliberate policy, symbolic in its implications, calculated in its message both to prisoners and to the wider world watching how America conducted itself. The reversal was absolute and complete. These pilots had entered the ambulances fully expecting to lose their lives to summary execution or slow death through neglect and abuse. Instead, they'd been delivered into a medical system where the enemy's discipline revealed itself not through brutality, but through precision, through compassion maintained under difficult circumstances, through restraint when vengeance would have been easy to justify. For the men who lay awake at night in those hospital wards, staring up at whitewashed ceilings while processing everything that had happened, one question circled through their thoughts endlessly and without resolution. If this was genuinely how the enemy treated captured combatants, if this represented standard American military procedure rather than some exception, then what exactly had their own leaders been concealing all along about the true nature of this war? The operating theatre blazed with light so intense it felt almost punishing, designed to eliminate any shadow that might obscure a surgeon's vision. Stainless steel instrument trays gleamed under those harsh overhead lamps, scalpels and clamps and sutures aligned like soldiers awaiting deployment orders. The German pilot lay rigid on the operating table despite the sedatives in his system, the thick smell of ether filling his lungs and making his thoughts swim. His heart pounded with a rhythm that owed as much to psychological shock as to blood loss and physical trauma. A surgeon dressed in a spotless white coat leaned over him, an American major judging by the insignia barely visible beneath the sterile gown. The surgeon's hands moved with absolute steadiness, eyes focused exclusively on the wound requiring attention, everything else in the world temporarily irrelevant. The war itself seemed to evaporate from existence in that moment, reduced to nothing more than the immediate medical crisis requiring skilled intervention. As sutures pulled tight across the pilot's torn side, drawing damaged tissue back together with methodical precision, his mind screamed with questions that had no outlet for expression. He'd personally flown combat missions over cities like Antwerp and Liège, had watched his payload of bombs tumble away toward targets that included bridges crowded with Allied soldiers and supply convoys. He'd killed men in those missions, or helped kill them at minimum. And now those same men he'd sought to destroy were working with careful concentration to save his life. His lips trembled with words that refused to form properly, questions that seemed simultaneously too large and too simple. Why would they do this? What possible purpose did it serve? Around him, the operating room continued its choreographed movement, everyone knowing their role and executing it without hesitation. Nurses handed instruments and gauze to the surgeon without needing to be asked, their timing perfected through countless previous procedures. Orderlies adjusted overhead lamps to maintain optimal lighting conditions. A medical technician periodically wiped sweat from the surgeon's brow to prevent it from dripping into the surgical field. Nobody sneered at the German patient beneath them. Nobody made accusations or demanded answers about which targets he'd bombed. The silence of pure professionalism spoke louder than any ideological speech could have, carried more weight than propaganda could ever achieve. Humanity in that moment wasn't expressed through words or grand gestures, but through the simple, sustained act of putting an enemy's body back together with the same care they'd extend to their own. In a corner of the same facility, another German airman stirred on his assigned cot, swimming up toward consciousness from whatever painkillers had been administered. He'd been brought into this hospital earlier that same day, his leg mangled beyond recognition by shrapnel that had torn through the cockpit during his aircraft's final moments. Hours before, when first captured, he'd cursed his American captors in whatever English he could muster, expecting only cruelty and extracting whatever defiance he could manage. Now he whispered hoarsely to the man in the neighbouring bed, his voice carrying a kind of stunned wonder. "They're treating us like human beings," he said. "Not like enemies, like men." That confession, later transcribed from a diary confiscated during routine security checks, became just one among many similar testimonies preserved in military archives, small voices bearing witness to larger transformations. Not every German prisoner accepted this mercy easily or without internal conflict. A few turned their faces toward the wall, unwilling to make eye contact with the hands that healed them, struggling with pride that refused to bend even under circumstances that should have shattered it. Pride proved difficult to abandon even when morphine dulled physical pain and steady voices offered reassurance of survival and eventual recovery. Yet even the most stubborn pride began to falter when pain receded and clear evidence accumulated that survival was genuinely the intended outcome rather than some elaborate preliminary deception. Numbers once again revealed the true magnitude of this reversal in the expected order of things. February 1945 alone saw records from United States Army hospitals listing more than 1,200 German airmen receiving active treatment in American medical facilities, most of them admitted within mere days of their capture. More than 900 of those wounded prisoners survived their injuries and moved on to prisoner of war compounds for the duration of their internment. For men who'd been explicitly conditioned to expect no quarter from Allied forces, who'd been told that capture meant torture and death. These statistics represented staggering proof that their absolute worldview was cracking apart under the pressure of observable reality. Beneath the surface-level medical procedures, beneath the statistics and the routine documentation, a deeper philosophical battle was being waged in these hospital wards. What did strength actually mean in the context of total war? Was it measured purely by the force of bombs dropped and cities destroyed, or did it somehow include the willingness to save an enemy's life when letting them die would have been easier and arguably justified? Was victory only about military conquest and territorial control, or did it encompass something about the endurance of moral codes even when surrounded by bloodshed and hatred? These questions didn't have simple answers, couldn't be resolved through military doctrine or ideological teaching. The ambulance itself, that ordinary box on wheels that should have been nothing more than a vehicle for medical transport, had transformed into something carrying symbolic weight far beyond its steel frame and Red Cross markings. To the German prisoners, it was no longer simply a piece of military equipment, but a moving embodiment of contradiction, carrying not just their wounded bodies, but an entire message about how power could be exercised. Real strength, the ambulance seemed to declare through its very existence, wasn't measured solely in firepower and destructive capacity. It revealed itself equally in restraint, in the conscious decision to preserve life even when those lives belonged to people who'd actively sought to kill you. At prisoner of war facilities like Camp Atterbury in Indiana, official reports documented the reactions of captured airmen when they first encountered the rows of military ambulances lined up beside American medical wards, all maintained and fueled and ready for deployment. A German captain was overheard muttering to a fellow prisoner that back in Berlin, such vehicles had become nearly non-existent after sustained months of Allied bombing campaigns, and that German civilians often bled to death simply waiting for medical assistance that would never arrive. To this captain, the sight of those gleaming American ambulances represented more than just superior logistics. They were physical proof of an industrial system capable of fighting total war while simultaneously preserving the infrastructure necessary to save lives, including enemy lives. The symbolism extended far beyond individual hospital corridors or medical facilities. In classified briefings among Allied officers, There existed a quiet understanding that every ambulance ride provided to a German prisoner constituted a form of propaganda more effective than any leaflet campaign. One internal memo noted explicitly that the demonstration of strength through healing rather than killing sent messages that no amount of written material could match. "We show them our superiority," the memo stated, "not because we have the capability to kill them, but because we maintain the discipline to heal them instead." The message wasn't subtle and wasn't intended to be. Whispers spread through prisoner of war camps as captured personnel shared their experiences and tried to make sense of what they'd witnessed. Some claimed they couldn't possibly write home about the quality of food they were receiving because no one still in Germany would believe that enemy hospitals served hot stew and fresh bread to prisoners. Others engaged in late-night arguments in their barracks, debating whether this apparent mercy represented genuine humanitarian concern or some more elaborate trick they hadn't yet identified. Could the same nation that had reduced Dresden to ash and rubble also distribute bandages to enemy wounded with such steady hands? The contradiction seemed impossible to reconcile. Statistical evidence continued to reinforce the paradox as the months progressed. By March 1945, the United States Army Medical Services had provided treatment to more than 10,000 German prisoners across facilities in Europe and throughout the United States. Many received care in the exact same hospitals and wards as Allied wounded, sleeping in beds separated by mere feet from the American soldiers they'd been trying to kill. Recovery rates remained consistently high, a documented fact that began filtering back to Germany through letters both official and smuggled, through prisoner exchanges and Red Cross communications. These accounts, whether they passed through military censors or evaded them entirely, started to erode the iron wall of propaganda more effectively than any battlefield defeat could have managed. One nurse stationed at Fort Sam Houston would recall years after the war ended those quiet moments when German patients simply stared at her in prolonged silence, their expressions unreadable. They looked as if they'd lost something fundamental, she remembered. Not just a battle or even a war, but some essential certainty about how the world operated. That silence carried more meaning than any curse or complaint could have conveyed. It was the sound of ideology beginning to unravel, of absolute beliefs encountering undeniable contradictions. For the Americans providing this care, the motivations were layered and complex. Practically speaking, keeping prisoners alive served multiple strategic purposes. Live prisoners could be questioned for intelligence, could be used as labor where permitted under international conventions, could potentially be exchanged. But the care extended beyond pure pragmatism into something more symbolic, a demonstration that civilization could be measured not only by industrial capacity and military might, but by the decision to remain human, even when vengeance lay easily within reach, when the temptation to abandon ethics in favor of retribution must have been powerful. The months continued their relentless progression toward war's end, and the European conflict lurched through its final convulsions toward inevitable conclusion. Many of the German airmen who'd experienced that first shocking ambulance ride, who'd been carried from battlefield to hospital while struggling to understand why their enemies were saving rather than killing them, now found themselves walking slowly and deliberately into prisoner of war compounds. Their wounds had healed or were healing. Their Luftwaffe uniforms had been replaced by issued work clothes that marked them clearly as prisoners. Yet despite the passage of time and the change in circumstances, the image of that initial medical intervention stayed etched in memory like a scar that refused to fade with time. At facilities like Camp Swift in Texas, observers noted a Luftwaffe sergeant who'd once flown escort missions over the industrial Ruhr region, spending his time sketching in a notebook. His drawings weren't of aircraft silhouettes or military insignia, the subjects one might expect from a former combat pilot. Instead, he drew ambulances repeatedly, always with that white cross emblazoned prominently, always shown driving through open fields under bright skies. When asked about his obsessive focus on this particular subject, he explained to fellow prisoners that nothing in his entire military experience, no bombing raid or victory formation over conquered territory, no parade through Berlin celebrating Luftwaffe achievements, had shaken his understanding of the world as deeply as that single ride in an American ambulance. To him, it represented irrefutable proof that war could wound far more than just the body. It could completely upend a person's entire mental framework. Letters intercepted by United States military censors revealed similar patterns of reflection and confession across many prisoners. One pilot wrote home in carefully worded phrases that the Americans were treating captured Germans as if they possessed human dignity, though German forces had not extended the same consideration to Allied cities under bombardment. Another confessed in tones heavy with shame that he genuinely feared his family back in Frankfurt would never believe what he tried to tell them, that enemy forces had actively saved his life rather than ending it when they possessed every practical reason and moral justification to do so. How could he explain that reality to people still living under a regime that claimed absolute moral superiority? The numbers behind these individual stories provided statistical weight to personal testimonies. By May of 1945, when Germany's surrender finally ended the European war, more than 25,000 Luftwaffe personnel had been captured by Allied forces, and a statistically significant portion of them had passed through Allied hospital facilities at some stage of their captivity. Thousands survived injuries that would almost certainly have proved fatal had they remained within Germany's shattered and overwhelmed medical infrastructure. The ambulance rides became in a very real sense journeys not merely back toward physical health, but toward confrontation with a reality that contradicted everything they'd been taught. The enemy's strength, they discovered, manifested itself not only through military might, but through the capacity to extend mercy even to those who'd shown none. In purely symbolic terms, the ambulance transcended its functional role as medical transport to become something approaching a mythological vehicle. It rolled across muddy European fields, carrying more than wounded bodies. It carried forward a message that would outlive any individual battle or campaign, a lesson that lingered in memory long after the last shots were fired. The true measure of victory, these experiences suggested, wasn't found exclusively in overwhelming enemy forces or capturing territory. It resided equally in the decision to maintain human compassion even when extending it to people who'd been actively trying to kill you, to preserve ethical standards when abandoning them, would have been completely understandable given the circumstances of total war. History's tendency to remember the spectacular and the dramatic means that certain sounds dominate our collective memory of the Second World War. The roar of bomber engines over German cities, the thunder of artillery barrages, the crack of small arms fire, smoke rising in thick columns over ruins that had once been neighborhoods and commercial districts. These are the images and sounds that populate documentaries and fill history books. Yet within those same years, quieter sounds carried lessons that proved more durable than battlefield victories, that outlived the temporary triumph of military conquest. The creak of ambulance wheels rolling over gravel roads, the rustle of fresh bandages being drawn tight around wounds, the whispered disbelief of a captured pilot slowly realizing that his enemy had chosen to preserve his life rather than take it. For the German airmen who experienced this unexpected mercy, those ambulance rides didn't erase their past actions or undo the destruction they'd participated in delivering. Nothing could reverse the bombs they'd dropped or resurrect the lives those bombs had taken. But the experience carved into their memories a paradox more powerful than any propaganda, a contradiction that proved stronger than ideological certainty. The men who'd once believed absolutely that strength meant domination and that compassion equaled weakness discovered a completely different definition of power, one literally stitched into their skin by enemy surgeons, one offered in something as simple as a glass of water extended by an enemy's hand. Long after the war ended, after these former prisoners had returned to a Germany transformed beyond recognition and rebuilt from rubble, some veterans confessed that their dreams didn't replay the terror of anti-aircraft fire or the adrenaline of aerial combat. Instead, they found themselves remembering the smell of ether in a foreign hospital ward, the soft voice of an American nurse adjusting a pillow, the moment when they'd looked up at their enemy and seen not vengeance in those eyes, but professional concern for their well-being. Such details seemed almost trivial when measured against the scale of global conflict involving millions of soldiers and countless battles. Yet they carried symbolic weight that statistics could never fully capture, proof that mercy extended to an enemy could fracture ideological certainty, that compassion shown under difficult circumstances could unsettle arrogance more effectively than military defeat. Statistics will always tell an important part of any historical story. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war processed through camps and hospitals, survival rates carefully recorded in official ledgers, medical facilities tallied and accounted for in military records. Numbers provide the framework for understanding scale and scope. But numerical data cannot capture the precise moment when a young man raised on hatred and taught to view enemies as subhuman looked up from a hospital bed and saw not vengeance but care reflected in the face bending over him. That moment exists beyond the reach of quantification. It can only be remembered and contemplated. The ambulance in this context becomes far more than a relic of military history, more than a vehicle that happened to exist during wartime. It transforms into a symbol of what humanity chooses to preserve even during its darkest and most violent hours, a reminder that bombs and artillery can divide nations and destroy cities, but medicine and compassion can remind us that the boundaries drawn by war don't necessarily erase the obligations of conscience. The decision to heal rather than harm, to preserve rather than destroy, to extend mercy when vengeance would have been easy to justify. These choices echo forward through time in ways that battlefield victories cannot match. They speak to questions about what civilization actually means, about how we measure our own humanity when circumstances make it most difficult to maintain.